This episode is brought to you by ProMensal.
What you do now and how you invest your time in looking after your health will determine how you age and the likelihood of what diseases you're going to get. And we have much more control than we think.
Welcome to Thriving in Menopause, brought to you by Prevention magazine. I'm Andrea Duval, and in this last episode of the current series, I want to focus on the flip side of menopause. We've spent a lot of time looking at perimenopause, so today I'd like to paint a bit of a picture of the next phase in our journey. I'm joined today by Dr. Fatima Khan, who's back with us to discuss this. Dr. Khan is a highly skilled menopause specialist at Epworth in Melbourne. Dr. Khan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Andrea.
So, the burning question, does this mean end of hot flushes, sleep disruption, mood swings, all of those things that we have come to think of as being part of perimenopause?
That's a great question. So we know when you hit that 12 months of no periods, the symptoms can still from that stage go on for another 7 years. That's on average. We know some women will continue to have symptoms into their 60s and 70s, but on average, the symptoms last around 7 to 8 years from 12 months of not having your periods. And that includes hot flushes, night sweats, sleep disturbance. But you might see a progression of symptoms. But the minute we mark the 12 months of no periods, that means we've got the reserve of estrogen is almost very low. And every year that progresses, you then start seeing the long-term consequences. And so there can be things like loss of bone density, changes in your cardiometabolic heart, changes in your brain health, which we'll discuss further. But I think in some of the symptoms that women will notice will be more the skin changes. So you might notice more vaginal dryness, bladder symptoms, irritability in the vaginal vulvar area. You might notice changes in your skin. We know we lose 10 to 20% of collagen. So you lose, the skin is more drier, itchy, wrinkly, and then hair and nails starts to show as well. So you'll notice more kind of this musculoskeletal skin changes.
I think it's really important for us to talk about these things so women are prepared. And there are some wonderful positives about what happens to your brain on the other side of perimenopause. In postmenopause years, you actually think more clearly, I think, than you have your whole life. However, let's talk about some of these symptoms and unpack them for listeners so that we can share with women what they need to be vigilant for at this time. One of the ones that I really was interested to chat to you about is thyroid disease.
Yeah, so we know thyroid is generally common, more common amongst women than men. And we see it between the ages of 45 to 55, but on average around the time of menopause. And lots of the symptoms coincide with the perimenopause symptoms.
So the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland in your throat, but if it's misbehaving, what are some of the symptoms that women are going to notice?
So the thyroid produces thyroxine, essentially, and that's a very important chemical which is in charge of your energy, metabolism, bone, heart. There's receptors all over the body. And so it depends on whether you have too much thyroid, which is hyperthyroidism, or too little, which is hypothyroidism. And the symptoms are complete opposite. So the hypothyroidism would be things like weight gain, decreased appetite. You might feel very cold. So even when it's summer and it's really hot, you're finding you're wearing your sweater and you've got a doona on. Your tolerance to cold really significantly drops. You might notice changes in your skin and your hair. So it becomes coarser, drier. We normally see a loss of eyebrows on the outer third. So you might find they're becoming thinner. And then obviously as the disease progresses, you start noticing things on your heart and then also the eye disease as well. So there's basically receptors all over the body. In terms of reproductive, women will notice that periods can become really heavy. And it also is one of the causes of infertility as well, or difficulty conceiving.
Wow. And that's hypothyroid?
Yes.
And so
that's not having enough.
And if you are hyperthyroid, what happens? What are you going to notice?
I guess there's effects all over the body. So the commonest one we'll notice is anxiety. So we didn't touch on the mental health with the hypo. So when you don't have enough thyroid, women will feel a lot more flat, a bit more low in their mood. As far as hyper is when you have lots of thyroxine circulating, you tend to feel really anxious, on edge. You'll get palpitations. Your heart rate's generally going really fast. You might notice you are losing weight. But this is, most women would want to lose weight, but this is a different kind of weight. You're finding you're actually eating a lot more and you're still losing lots of weight. And they'll say, their clothes aren't fitting anymore. And then you've got other things that can impact the heart, the bones, because you eventually are ramming up everything in that engine room and it's burning up and using your resources. And we don't want that either.
I guess the good news out of all of this is that there is a simple fix.
Yes. So the initial is obviously once you're aware you have the symptoms, it's a simple blood test, doesn't even require fasting. And then if you have insufficient thyroid level or thyroxine level, we tend to give you thyroxine. We just replace the hormone, straightforward. And then if you're going too fast, then we need to give you some medication which blocks the conversion of active thyroxine. And so the aim is we measure your thyroid stimulating hormone, the range, and make sure it's in a balanced range where we're not producing too much or too little. And then normally the symptoms resolve when those levels are stabilized.
I want to talk to you about bones. This is the thing, when we talk about osteoporosis, we tend to think about that as an old lady disease. And I've got to say, when I read about, protect yourself against falls, it's like, for heaven's sake, I'm seeing a grey-haired old lady with a walking stick and I'm not there yet. And yet, this is a time when the choices we're making will determine whether that frail little old lady is us in 20 years' time, right?
I think that's a great point. I think you should look at midlife or being menopause as a fantastic opportunity to optimize your health. So your health now would determine how you spend the next 10, 20, 30 years, how you age. And I think in our 20s and 30s, we take health for granted. But at 50, you could have okay, so what... we're going off tangent here, but what are the leading causes of death for women in Australia? And those are Alzheimer's disease followed by heart disease. And a major cause of disability is osteoporosis. When I have a patient or a woman sitting in front of me at 50, I say, okay, so we know we need to look after your brain, your bones, and your heart. You're 50 now. On average, women live till 84.5, but most women live till 90. So you've got 40 years. What you do now and how you invest your time in looking after your health will determine how you age and the likelihood of what diseases you're going to get. And we have much more control than we think. Because I think before we were told, it's just aging. This is what happens and this is what you get. But we've had great studies in the Lancet. There's 21 at least points that you can do and action points that we can all take back to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. There's plenty we can do for heart disease and bone disease. So just because we get these diseases as we get older, I think we have at least 80% or more control in preventing them. So moving back to bone. So that's a great one. And I always say osteoporosis has no symptoms until you trip on that pavement and you break your hip or your ankle or another part of your skeletal bone structure. So we know at the time of menopause, the decline in estrogen, we lose anything from 10 to 20% of bone density. So that will be asymptomatic. You will not have any symptoms of it unless we do a bone density scan, and that may show osteoporosis or osteopenia. Commonly, I see osteopenia, which is the stage before osteoporosis. So when we look at the scan, osteopenia is when you're starting to lose a little bone density. And I think that's where we need to be more proactive and saying, okay, I've already got a bit of loss. Let's not become osteoporotic. And what can we do to prevent that? So obviously, estradiol is a potent stimulator of bone, and estrogen therapy is used to treat for osteoporosis and prevention. A lot of women don't always need estrogen. So there are simple things you can do, which is strength training. A lot of us don't do weight-bearing exercises. We're heavily focused on cardio, which is great for the heart, but we forget the bones. And we know a condition called osteosarcopenia. So the loss of muscle also leads to loss of bone mass. And as you imagine, when we get older and we kind of have this frail lady bending over, that's because she's lost the height of a lumbar vertebra, and they're spontaneously fractured. And so hence she's got that hunchback. And then she loses that balance trying to get out of chair or just maneuvering around, and she'll fall. And this is all linked to partly loss of muscle as well. So when we talk about bone, when we're restoring bone, we need to really build up muscle, because muscle helps with bone density, and it also prevents falls. So it's a no-brainer. So the way to support it is resistance training, at least 3 times a week, weight bearing, and we can do this at home. There's lots of exercises. If you just go onto any poster, Google exercises for resistance training for osteoporosis, and you can do them at home. I think another one that women ask is vitamin D and calcium. Normally, we don't recommend additional calcium. We have sufficient supplementation through a well-balanced diet. And if you have a diet deficient in calcium, I would be more worried about that than actually just supplementing it. But vitamin D is something we do recommend supplementing because, of course, my main source is from the sun, but we also have to balance the risk of exposure to skin, to UV radiation, and the risk of skin cancer. So a lot of women would be wearing sunscreen and would be covering up and may not be getting the vitamin D levels they need. So especially in Melbourne, where it's always overcast for 6 months of the year, they all take daily supplementation. In the summer, they may reduce that, and there's lots of variation. Some may say 1,000 IU a day. If you have already got osteoporosis, we may increase that. So it's an individual person. It's an individual decision on how much we replace it.
Next thing I want to talk to you about is cardiovascular disease. When it comes to our hearts, I think we're all living in a very stressful world right now. Are there particular reasons why this becomes more of a risk at this point?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you look at women and men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and if you compare heart disease is more prevalent in men. As we hit menopause, the decline in estrogen, and if you follow 10 years onwards, actually we almost come to the same level or even surpass heart disease, because the lack of estrogen causes us to become, I guess, more vulnerable in our cardiometabolic profile and increases our risk of heart disease. And prior to menopause, estrogen protects the heart by protecting the blood vessels, blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, insulin resistance, and all that cardiometabolic profile. So what can we do? If you can imagine, there's estrogen receptors in our blood vessels, and it keeps it really nice and elastic and soft, like elastic rubber band. And so the blood pressure stays nice and low. We don't get debris like cholesterol plaques building up. The heart's beating really well. And we also, along with that, find that we don't tend to have much abdominal fat around pre-menopause. But we know that around the menopause, there's a distribution. You may not gain weight, but there's a distribution of fat around the tummy, which makes us more insulin resistant. And that is, again, linked with inflammation and cardiovascular disease. So at menopause, you're more than ever predisposed to getting high blood pressure, high cholesterol, pre-diabetes, and soon you'll be on all these medications such as blood pressure to manage your cholesterol and maybe even diabetes. And you'll see women who wouldn't have changed their diet, wouldn't have changed their exercise, and they suddenly are finding that their cholesterol and blood pressure has gone up. And it's because of the loss of estrogen.
So what can we do?
So you can go back to your basic fundamental pillars of health. So improving good quality sleep, daily movement. It doesn't have to be strenuous, and it has to be variety. So I think when we think of menopause, we think we've got to do really long 60-minute exercises. I don't like calling it exercise. I like calling it daily movement. Commit to a daily movement, make it variety, diversify it to keep it fun and engaging. Because daily movement, even if it's little amounts in what we call exercise snacks, is actually shown to boost not only brain health, but also heart health and reduce your risk of diabetes and cholesterol and help with that visceral adiposity around the abdomen. Second thing is nourishing food. So cutting back on inflammatory, deep fried, highly processed food. Thinking Mediterranean diet, we've got lots of evidence for nice plant-based, lots of good fats with good sources of fish. The things that we all know. I said anything that's grown on this planet, on this earth, in the ground is basically safe to eat. So try and eat a lot more whole food, wholesome diet. And then finally, I think, which we don't talk much about, is reducing stress. But rather than saying reducing stress, it's better to say improving quality relationships. And there's lots of studies. There's a recent study that came out of Harvard as well about, the key to longevity, healthy aging, and happiness is the quality of relationships. And you normally find women become quite introvert at this time in menopause because they've got these symptoms. They feel no one's talking about it. There's a lot of shame and stigma. So you might find you're not hanging out with your friends and going for that walk. You may not be meeting your friend for coffee. And I think just elevating that mindset and saying, actually, no, I'm going to go have a coffee, have a bit of a whinge, and then move on. And I think when we have this collective shared experience of menopause, that in itself is really comforting, and it motivates women to then say, okay, I'm going to do my movement. I'm going to eat well. Everyone's experiencing this. And this is this kind of sense of control of your mind and your body. And that's how you navigate it. We've got lots of women without estrogen who have great, healthy lives, especially if you look at Mediterranean regions. They don't take estrogen. They live till 80, 90. But what they have that we don't necessarily have in modern Western society is social connection, that sense of meaningful relationship, knowing that you're secure, knowing that someone's here with you, sharing and listening to you. I think that is really, really important.
We'll be right back after this.
Perimenopause can actually start in your 40s. Declining estrogen production during perimenopause brings on changes to menstrual cycles and often the onset of hot flushes, night sweats, mood swings, and sexual problems. Promensal Peri is specifically designed for perimenopausal women and can help relieve these common menopausal symptoms. Promensal Peri is available at leading pharmacies across Australia and offers a cost-effective treatment at under $1 a day. When things start to change, try Promensal Peri. Always read the label and follow the directions for use.
Okay, we're back.
And I think because we're having open conversations, podcasts like your platform, women are feeling less isolated. They're feeling they can share their experience without shame.
I'm going to touch on something you spoke about earlier, and that is the change in our skin, most particularly vaginal dryness. Now, I want you to tell me your favourite remedies for this.
So, listen, there's a range. So I think the main thing to understand is why do we have vaginal dryness? And that's the lack of estrogen. The dryness results in multiple things. So there's 3 issues I always say when it comes to lack of estrogen in the pelvic floor. So lubrication, and that can present as itching. You might find it's a bit sore. Some of my women can't ride their bicycle anymore. So, it's not just saying the vaginal dryness. How does that impact your quality of life? If it's stopping from riding that bike, well, then it needs to be treated. The lack of lubrication can impact intimacy. So a lot of women will find that they can't be sexually active because it's really painful. And, that's really important for women. So we need to, again, treat that and address that. And then finally, we know there's altered pH and microflora as a result of the decline in estrogen, which results in recurrent bladder infections and thrush. And again, if you're getting those, we need to replace estrogen in that way. So estrogen can be replaced very safely. It comes in a cream and a pessary, and it stays very local. So there's no systemic absorption. If women are really worried about it, they can be reassured that this will work very well locally and relieve your symptoms. And that's the gold standard treatment.
And that's something you get on prescription?
Yes. So estrogen is available very easily via your GP. You don't need to see a specialist. And, even if you're someone who's got a family history of breast cancer or you personally have breast cancer, we can safely give vaginal estrogen. If you've got breast cancer, I always say if it's hormone sensitive, speak to your oncologist. But a lot of women would be worried, about breast cancer and family history, and they can't take it. Vaginal estrogen is restricted to the vaginal and pelvic floor. So I definitely would recommend you to go and see your doctor and do a trial of it for a few months. And if it benefits, you can use that. If you don't want to try estrogen, then you have two other products that are available very commonly and widely on the market, on the internet, and in most pharmacies. And they're lubricants and they're moisturizers. And it's important to know how to use them. So moisturizer is just like a cream-based formula that you apply daily in your vulva. So most of the time we moisturize head to body, but we forget our vulva and our vaginal area, and that needs equal attention. It's got skin cells, it needs hydration. So every day moisturize that area, and there's lots of great vaginal moisturizers that are pH neutral and plant-based and organic, and they can be found anywhere. There's alternatives such as coconut oil and lots of oil-based therapies that you can use. And then obviously sexual intercourse is more to do with the vaginal dryness that's internal. And that's when you use a lubricant. So the lubricant tend to be gel-based. So they tend to be colorless and odorless in most cases, but they're perfume-free, and you use them just before sexual intercourse. So that's not as uncomfortable. So I think pelvic health, vaginal health, and it's called GSM now, which is genitourinary symptom of the menopause, because it's not just vaginal dryness. We know we lose bladder control. So a lot of women will find they're more incontinent. They're waking up at night multiple times. They have a glass of water and they're running to the loo. They're doing their exercise and they're leaking. A little bit of vaginal estrogen will help with that. It's important to know that vaginal lubricants and cream will not restore the estrogen levels. They're just restoring the hydration.
Thank you. That's really useful. I know we're speaking about a lot of things that must sound quite negative, but as I say, I think that's where being forewarned can help women feel confidence that they're not alone in this. Something that women at this time, when we're talking about vanity, say, is thinning hair. Estrogen plays a role in this as well?
Yes. So estrogen, progesterone to a certain extent, that's mainly estrogen. And I think generally going through menopause is a form of stress on a woman's body. The lack of estrogen, suddenly your organs don't have this very vital hormone that it's had. It's very important, not just for reproduction, but for optimal heart, bone, brain, and gut function. And so the sudden fluctuating levels or the decline in it can trigger a stress response. And when your body's in a form of stress and the estrogen is declining, we know we lose 10 to 20% of collagen. So with that, you will lose hair, and some women get quite distressed by it. But, hair is very complex. Commonly I see women with very low iron. So if you saw a dermatologist, the first thing they'll say is, what are the micronutrients you're deficient in? Because hair takes a lot of energy to grow. So if it's not estrogen, you'll also find that if you're deficient in biotin, certain other vitamins like iron, you'll find that you're losing hair. So replacing those simply will restore that. A lot of the dermatologists will also use medicated therapies to help with hair loss. So I think the main thing is to identify the cause of hair loss. Some of it's autoimmune, like alopecia, so that's nothing to do with hormone. Some of it's micronutrient based, so we see lots of it around low iron. Again, replacing iron will help. And then some of it's obviously hormonal as well. So again, you don't always need hormones to replace that. It's a kind of looking at what the root cause is. But normally, estrogen is linked with loss of collagen. Kind of hair, nail, and skin go together, essentially.
So we're speaking a lot about physical symptoms. I like to just consider the mind for a minute. Recently, we spoke with a neuroscientist about the positive things that happen to our brains after menopause. As a doctor working in the menopause space, what's your experience?
That's interesting. So we know when you're going through the menopause transition, especially perimenopause, those sudden fluctuations can trigger memory issues. So it's very common to become more forgetful, word finding difficulty, walking into a room not knowing what you've done, concentration reduced, focus reduced, and brain fog. So suddenly you're feeling you've got dementia. But we know that after the transition and post-menopause, the brain is recalibrating. It's very adaptive. Our body is very smart. So it adapts very quickly as the hormones start to decline. So we've done studies around the perimenopause and post-menopause. And of course, around the perimenopause, there is decreased energy metabolism. There is decreased activity, neuronal activity. But then we know if you follow them up after 10 years in their 60s, and every study's got different kind of woman, it recalibrates. And so it adapts to working in this new environment with different resources and almost low or no estrogen. So it's reassuring to know that that your brain function will find a new equilibrium. But also looking around, we have lots of women who don't get dementia, Alzheimer's. And so just having this simplistic model of saying estrogen we know is neuroprotective, it does help. We cannot say it prevents dementia. For every 10 studies that tell you estrogen prevents it, there's a study saying it doesn't prevent it. And so it's very complicated. If you're looking at brain health and healthy aging, we know certain things are really useful. So keeping brain active. So a lot of women will retire on average 59, and then they stop learning. And so to keep continuing those neuronal connection and restoring the brain function, learn a new language. We know when you learn a new language, you make more neuronal connections, learning a new hobby. So learning is really, really healthy for the brain. So if you're worried about dementia, worried about your brain health, learning is great. Of course, you need to focus on your sleep, your exercise. Those are, I keep repeating myself, those are fundamental to any kind of disease prevention. But you can all be reassured that post-menopause, the brain does recalibrate to a new norm.
A happier norm where, yes, without the brain fog, with a sharper sense of focus. We'll be right back after this. Okay, we're back. So listening to what you're saying about life post-menopause, we really need to be mindful of this from our mid-40s and be planning for this next life phase, yeah?
Exactly, that's correct. And I said before, we take our health for granted in our 20s and 30s, but how you look after yourself in our 40s and 50s determine how you age. And sometimes it's about looking back, and some of these autopilot habits that we have, we may need to look at them, reset new boundaries, pay more attention to ourselves, and focus on the fundamental pillars. So that's sleeping, daily movement, eating well, having good quality, positive, meaningful connections in our lives. Not all connections necessarily are positive, so it's important to look at those. But I think just becoming aware of the symptoms. So you've got platforms like yours, and there's so much information now of knowing what the symptoms are, recognizing them, and being self-advocates and going to a doctor or a healthcare professional who can help you navigate the perimenopause and menopause, because there's no need to suffer. And we talk about suffering. I think it's important to realize that with this podcast, you might think, oh my God, I'm really scared. There's a fear sometimes about experiencing and navigating the menopause. Only 30% of women will have severe symptoms. 30% of women will have no symptoms. I have women who never get a hot flush. They never have a night sweat. They sleep well. They're completely fine. They breeze through it. And you can be one of those women. So take a breath and not to worry about it. And then the ones in the middle will navigate it with the lifestyle factors. So I think it's number one, understanding what the symptoms are. But if the symptoms are intrusive, they're impacting your quality of life, how do you determine what is severe and what warrants treatment? And I always say to women, is this impacting your ability to function? Is this stopping you from doing the things you want to do? The exercise? Is it stopping you from going out to meet your friend for coffee? Is this stopping you from taking that promotion you need to take at work that you've invested 20 years in your career? Is this impacting your intimate relationship with your partner, your relationship with your children? Then yes, these symptoms warrant treatment. There's lots of options. There's hormone treatment, there's non-hormone treatment, there's complementary treatment, there are psychological treatments. So I think number one is understanding there's lots of options, and there's no need to just put up with it and compromise on this one life that you have. And when you've got the right tools and resources, most women will live a great, healthy, positive life after menopause. And I see these women and they're vibrant, they're healthy, they're enjoying their life. Could be career, it could be family, it could just be their communities. So it's important to have that very positive visualization of you getting older. And visualization is quite important. I always say to women, how do you visualize yourself in your 70s and 80s? Do you want to be running after your grandchildren, going up the staircase, exercising, being independent and driving? Then yes, you need to focus on the fundamental pillars and get the right help. And there's no reason why we all can't age with good health and good physical and emotional health.
Thanks, Dr. Khan. The elephant in the room in all of this is, I guess, that very powerful awareness of we're getting older and aging, and that has a whole lot of connotations, doesn't it?
Yes, I get it's a psychological, emotional, and also cultural connotation when we navigate the menopause. So obviously for a woman on the individual level, the loss of her periods is the loss of ability to be fertile anymore. Most women will view that as liberating. But for some women, that the lack of ability to be fertile means you're not young anymore, you're not youthful. And we've always given more attention to women's value as being able to reproduce. That's what it was. And in evolutionary terms, it's, the more fertile you are, it's a survival of your species. And so they're selected, I guess, in terms of evolutionary terms. In terms of society, if you look around you, our magazines, our media, the portrayal is essentially much younger women. So there isn't a place where women feel visible. And so when they hit menopause, they're suddenly feeling quite low emotionally and psychologically and getting these physical symptoms. So you can really spiral down and start feeling quite invisible, irrelevant. A lot of women have a lot of body shame. And that's because we've been conditioned for 50 years of our life to look a certain way. And it's actually quite horrifying, the words we say to ourselves in the mirror about ourselves.
Absolutely.
I think it's about looking forward rather than backward with a positive mindset, but also disengaging from some of the stereotypes that we have for older women in our society and culture, which is being challenged and changing.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Let's stop looking at celebrities and let's celebrate ourselves. When you talk about connection, I know there are a lot of online forums and wonderful menopause Facebook groups even. Is that been your experience? Do you find that some of your clients are part of those?
So Facebook groups and social media groups aren't bad. There tend to be groups if you have a collective interest. So if it's to do with weight loss or nutrition or exercise. But otherwise, you really want to have those connections in real life. So, if you've got to 50, you would have accumulated some. I think it's not about quantity, it's about quality of relationships. You don't need 10, 20 girlfriends. Even that 2 or 3 would be great. And then it's just about actively participating and reaching out to them and saying, haven't seen you. Would you like to go for a walk Thursday morning at 7 a.m.? I met a friend at 7 a.m. on the beach the other day for a walk before dropping off the kids to school. So I think it's about finding ways to connect, even if you've been disconnected from certain friends, because you'll be surprised how when you share your burden, that's half the issue gone, because the oxytocin you get from giving a hug to your girlfriend and that joy is not going to be there from online. And so it's about investing on those relationships, even having a telephone chat with someone and just going through what's happening with you. And you'll find that, oh, okay, she's going through the same thing. Oh, okay, it's my symptoms don't feel that bad anymore.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks, listeners. This was the last episode in this series, and I hope you'll join us for our next season when we come back in October. Meanwhile, for more great information about living your best life at midlife, pick up a copy of Prevention magazine. I'm Andrea Duval. Bye for now.